Hello, I'm Troy Deutmeyer, Field Agronomist for DuPont Pioneer in Northeast Iowa, and today I would like to visit with you about our growing point agronomy trials and in specifically the nitrogen trials that we had throughout the state of Iowa this year. One of the first slides that you see there is our yield response to different soils, and as we know, nitrogen is a very complex problem for our customers, and one of our goals of our growing point agronomy trials is to help them get better return on investment for their nitrogen as well as try to minimize the environmental impact. One of the things that makes nitrogen difficult for our customers to manage is the fact that nitrogen responds to different soils differently. And one of the things that we tried to do is group the soils in the state of Iowa into about 6 different buckets. And the reason for that is because we have hundreds and hundreds of different soil types here in the state of Iowa, we can't test in every one of those. So if we could narrow that down to 6 different buckets, we have a better chance of giving our customers good recommendations. In the first slide there, you'll see how we broke these soil groups down, and essentially we have above average soils, average soils, and below average soils, and then we broke those 3 down into 2 separate buckets among them with poorly drained and well drained. So we may have an above average well drained soil and above average poorly drained soil, etc. And as you can see from the slide, that as we actually lost productivity in those soils, we actually saw an increase in the response to an additional 50 units of nitrogen over the grower's practice. And this is significant because in the past, typically we think that maybe on these higher yielding above average type soils is where we need to put additional nitrogen. And our data is showing actually just the opposite. Some of these soils that are below average might have higher sand content, lower organic matter, and therefore may have more leaching and more denitrification and cannot mineralize the nitrogen from soil organic matter as well as some of our more highly productive soils. And so CSR, as you all know, is a very common descriptor of the productivity of a soil. And so when we looked at our data across different CSRs, you can see that once again some of those below average kind of type soils, that 40 to maybe 65, 70 CSR range, actually had very large responses to an additional 50 units of nitrogen in 2013 and 2014. And then what's interesting, as we actually got into some of our higher CSR soils, we actually saw the response go back up. And our thought behind that is when you think about a 90 to 100 CSR soil, oftentimes those soils are what we call our flat black soils. And when you think about getting a 3, 4, or 5 inch rain on those soils, the water does not have much opportunity to run off, and therefore it has to percolate down through the soil profile, and we have denitrification and leaching. And so we're thinking that slope can play a large impact on nitrogen and the use of nitrogen in different soils. So as we go to the next slide, you can see that we have some different examples of different soils broken out. And after what I just told you, you can expect that a Lawler soil, which is essentially a flatter soil, actually maybe a little bit of sandy subsoil in it, we saw a pretty significant response to nitrogen. Then as we look over at the very right-hand side, we see some D-slope soils and very little response to nitrogen. What's interesting as we break the soils down even further is when you look at the Tama, which is a B-slope soil, along with a Colo soil, which is also B-sloped, you can see the Tama had almost no response to nitrogen, whereas the Colo had a fairly large response to nitrogen. And when you think about this, a Tama soil is located on the ridge top and has what we would call a convex kind of type shape, and therefore these heavier rains, we have more surface runoff. Whereas a Colo soil, the position on the landscape there is more in the bottomlands and the drainage ways, and actually has what we call a concave type slope to it. So therefore, the water tends to concentrate in that Colo soil, and once again, we see a large response to nitrogen. So not only do we maybe need to be thinking about the slope of the soil, but also about the elevation, the position on the landscape, as well as whether it's a convex or concave kind of type slope. On the final slide, what we're showing there is what we found in some of these below average and average soils and the response to nitrogen across different populations. Our customers are doing a lot of variable rate seeding, and they may also be adding variable rate nitrogen based off of those variable rate seeding applications. Oftentimes in these below average or maybe even average soils, we are backing off on our plant populations because of what our growing point agronomy trials have shown us in the past. While this is probably still the best practice, our data has shown that if we maintain some higher plant populations and then add additional units of nitrogen to these soils or to these areas, we can actually have some very large yield responses. So moving forward, maybe the concept might be is to treat these low yielding areas differently, maybe apply the nitrogen a little bit later, not back off the population as much, and hopefully raise the overall field average. One of the things also that we need to keep in mind as we do this is these below average soils probably are losing a lot of their upfront early season nitrogen application. So again, for return on investment and for improvement in water quality, most likely these below average soils will need to have that nitrogen applied later on in the season, maybe at the V10 to before tassel time frame.